first of all, to the facts. So Ilana Dayan said, and not for the first time, she reported that the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, and the IDF chief of staff, Herzl Halevi, had, beginning in March of 2023, insisted to Netanyahu a number of times that the judicial reform that his government wanted to undertake, or was undertaking at the time, was going to cause a war. Now, this is a political statement. It's got nothing to do with military information. And in fact, the prime minister, each time that he was warned, the last time was just a couple of days before the war, was, well, what are the indications that the enemy is about to attack us? And they had none. So that's how you knew that this was political extortion rather than an actual military alert that they were giving the prime minister. But they were wrapping it up in this wrapping paper of a military threat. At the same time, they continued to tell the prime minister that Hamas was deterred, that Hamas was not intending to go to war, and that what Israel needed to do to prevent another outbreak of violence with Hamas was to give Gazans more work permits in the border areas, in the kibbutzim, and in Sderot and in other places, and also to allow Qatar to give more cash to the Hamas regime in Gaza. So they wanted to continue appeasing and up the ante of what Israel was allowing Qatar to give and what Israel was going to give to stabilize Hamas's grip on power and empower and enrich Hamas. So that was their thing with Hamas, but they kept giving these amorphous claims. And in the meantime, if we remember, beginning around March 2023, or maybe even before that, you had these generals, these retired generals, these retired IDF chiefs of staff, and these activists who were reserve officers, reserve pilots in the Air Force, reserve commanders in commando units, particularly Sayeret Matkal, which is associated with the left and is therefore claimed to be touted as the greatest commando unit in Israel. It's also the commando unit that the prime minister served in and his older brother Yoni Netanyahu served in and commanded during the Entebbe raid, where he was killed freeing hostages in 1976 from Palestinian terrorists. And so the Sayeret Matkal and the reserve pilots were pushing this operation to take apart, to dismantle the IDF by refusing to serve in reserves. And they were never really called out by the leadership of the IDF, not by Herzl Halevi, not by the Air Force commander Tomer Ron, not by anybody. And Tomer Bar, nobody was calling them out. So they're dismantling the IDF's reserve corps, which is the main thing that the IDF relies on to fight wars, as we've seen over the past year and 2 months. And they're calling for people not to serve in reserves. And they're having massive rallies calling for people not to serve in reserves. And nobody is being investigated by the police. This is a criminal, this is a crime. This is a felony. It's, inciting a rebellion in the IDF. That's a serious felony. It's very close to treason. And yet nobody was ever investigated for this. And Netanyahu was screaming out against it, saying, you got to stop it. Why aren't you stopping it? Why? He's saying to Gali Bar Miar, why aren't you investigating it? And she wasn't investigating it. And Tomer Bar and Herzl Halevi were doing nothing more than like sort of one weak criticism of what was happening, but nobody was thrown out of the army. Nobody was thrown out of reserves. Nobody was really disciplined for any of this stuff. Okay, so they're using this refusal to serve in the IDF as a means to then tell Netanyahu to be the instruments of the extortion, coming to the prime minister like mafia bosses saying, nice army you got there, be a real shame if something happened to it. And by the way, if something happens to it, as it is now happening, right, because people aren't serving in reserves, and we're going to be facing a major war. That was what they were saying to the prime minister. But they didn't say anything about Hamas. And in a second report that came out, I think on Saturday night, Omri Maniv from Channel 12 came out with more information about all of the explicit warnings that the chief of staff of the army, the head of intelligence, the head of Southern Command, the head of the Shin Bet received from the field saying, look, Hamas is preparing for war. Look, there's this plan that we intercepted. We called it the Walls of Jericho. Look, they're training for it. This isn't a theoretical plan like you claim. Look, in June 2023, they had a massive training rehearsal for the invasion. It's imminent. It's going to happen anytime. It's going to be an act of historic proportions. They got explicit warnings, and you had these NCOs and intelligence officers from the Gaza division who were basically, jumping up and down and screaming, take this seriously. And Herzl Halevi didn't take it seriously. Aaron Khaliwa wasn't taking it seriously. The previous commander of the Southern Command, General Toledano, wasn't taking it seriously. And then Finkelstein, who had the unfortunate honor of being the chief, the commander of Southern Command, beginning 3 months before October 7th, also wasn't clear on why this was supposed to be taken seriously. Maniv also reported that former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was actually given information about the Walls of Jericho plan when he came to the Gaza division to say goodbye as he was leaving the premiership in May, I think, of 2022, and he didn't take it seriously either. But Netanyahu himself was never informed of it. So Ilana Dayan, so Omri Maniv deepened our understanding that there's really no way to avoid the conclusion that the heads of the IDF and the Shin Bet, they're responsible for Israel's failure to prevent October 7th. They had all of the information, warning after warning after warning, report after report after report. There was a drill in the Southern Command, but I think it was the paratroopers who participated in it to block precisely the kind of invasion that Israel experienced on October 7th, and they failed. And then General Toledano, who was in charge of the Southern Command at this time, this is what Maniv reported, said it's not a big deal because it's not a serious scenario that we're taking seriously. That's not the scenario that we're taking seriously, so it's okay that you failed. We'll get them once they cross the fence, which, of course, we didn't, right? And so, the IDF just dismissed the seriousness of all of these warnings. So it's very apparent from everything that we've already learned that the Army, the Chief of Staff, the head of intelligence, Toledano, who's a former head of Southern Command to a degree as well, Finkelman, who's a serving head of the Southern Command, the division commander of Gaza division commander, and others, the head of operations, they were responsible for October 7th from Israel's perspective. They didn't block it. And most importantly, they never told Netanyahu about any of this. They never told him about the Walls of Jericho. They never informed the National Security Council. They never informed him about Hamas's training to carry out the Walls of Jericho. Nothing. They didn't tell him anything at all. And so he was left in the dark. And they knew everything and disregarded the warnings, completely disregarded the warnings. And they told the prime minister, on the one hand, that the warnings for war owed to his government's political plan to reform the courts. They were extorting him politically, saying that the army's going to just fall apart and we're not going to do anything to prevent it so long as you maintain your plan to reform the judiciary in Israel. So they're working hand in glove with the state prosecutors and the judges here. And then they didn't tell him anything except the way to block Hamas from stop being deterred, to stop deterring Hamas is to stop paying them off, right? And so pay them off more, you'll get more deterrence. I mean, it's a stupid thing. Obviously, you're not deterring anybody if you're bribing them. Bribery is not a form of deterrence, but that's another issue for another day, that they don't even know what deterrence is. All the same, 6:29 in the morning is the first time that Netanyahu ever heard anything about the threat from Hamas. That is when Hamas actually began its strike. At 6:29 in the morning, his military attaché, Avi Gil, calls him up, wakes him up, and says, Mr. Prime Minister, we're under missile assault. Okay, and I think from my perspective, the most horrible thing about this whole report is that Netanyahu says to him, why are they attacking us? That's his first response. Why are they attacking us? Because he had no information. And then he said to him, I don't see anything in the intelligence briefing to indicate that that they were planning on attacking us. He said that 11 minutes later at a second call that they had at 6:40. So the prime minister asked the right question. Why are they attacking us? And then he said to him, he says, why are they attacking at 6:29? Just something 11 minutes. He said, we had no warning. I don't see anything in the intelligence reporting. And then he said, we need to see the breadth of the attack. And if we have to mobilize the reserves, we need to convene as quickly as possible the general staff. So Netanyahu is responding to the information, and he's giving the exact right response. We have to convene the general staff. He was the first one to arrive at headquarters like 20 minutes after he hung up the phone with his military attaché. Nobody else was there yet. Herzl Halevi, I think, traipsed in at like 8 o'clock in the morning. So Netanyahu is sitting there with his staff officers, right? And he had no information. They had hidden all of this information from him. They never told him anything. And his initial responses are correct. And then he said they might try to kidnap somebody. When he finally got the indication that they were actually crossing the border, he said this may be in order to kidnap people. So everything that the prime minister is saying, remember, I didn't tell you this now, but I'll just recall that there were 2 conversations of the heads of the IDF and Ronen Bar from the Shin Bet, one at midnight, one at 4 o'clock in the morning, when they were getting more and more indications that Hamas was about to invade, and they didn't wake up the prime minister, and they didn't wake up the defense minister either. So they had all of these clear indications of an imminent invasion, and they didn't call the prime minister to alert him. Imagine if he had had the same responses at 4 o'clock in the morning. They would have woken up the guards. They would have started sending reservists down to the Gaza border in order to reinforce it at 4 o'clock or at midnight. And I mean, we know this because we see what he said at 6:30 in the morning when he was just getting in the information. Imagine if he had prior warning, just a couple of hours, things would have looked very different on October 7th for certain. So Channel 12, so Uvda comes out with this report, this investigative report, that's supposed to incriminate Netanyahu and blame him for October 7th, but the facts that they presented all spoke to reinforcing the already apparent conclusion, which is that the IDF general staff, led by Herzl Halevi and Aron Khaliwa, the head of military intelligence, and Ronen Bar in the Shin Bet, they blocked all of this information from the prime minister. Their judgment on absolutely everything was totally wrong. And at the same time, they were extorting the prime minister politically by siding with, refusing to take action against widespread refusal to serve in reserves by pilots and by the commando officers. And in the event on October 7th, you had these heroes who are sprinting literally to the border to defend the communities that are being overrun, right, and dying. And nothing from the Air Force. Nothing. No operation. Nobody, they had nothing. The Air Force didn't show up. So you're looking at this situation and you see which army actually showed up, not the general staff, not the Air Force. Not reservists from these units. No, it was soldiers and reservists who just took it upon themselves and they went. It was a disaster of epic proportions on every level, operationally and otherwise. And the prime minister, who had never been informed of it, he was the one who showed up. And now they're trying to frame him by saying, look, we were using political extortion of the army in order to force you not to reform our partners in the deep state and the judiciary, right? And therefore, we get off the hook for not warning you about the war, because look, we actually did, but they didn't. Like he said when they said to him, that the legal reform is causing the war. He said, where? Who's going to attack? And they didn't have an answer to that.